Okay, so how many of you like to watch stuff on YouTube? How many are YouTube fans? How many of you have heard of a show called Good Mythical Morning, or Rhett and Link? Okay, yeah, good number of you. How many of you knew that Rhett and Link, who make that show, I point it this way? Okay. Rhett and Link were Christians. How many of you knew they were Christians? Not everybody, okay. Now, how many of you knew that they are no longer Christians? Okay, some of you have heard about this. So, yeah, right before the quarantine, I think a few months back, they came out on their YouTube channel and their podcast to say they no longer believe in Christianity or God. Yeah, and there's Rhett and Link there. Rhett's the guy on the left, if you didn't know. Now, I don't know about you, but if you're like me, and I know I am, then these stories can be a little upsetting. They can be a little unsettling, a little distressing, a little scary, right? Because it's easy when someone says why they don't believe and they've never been in the church, or they, don't know a whole lot, maybe they never had any good teaching, you can kind of dismiss that. But when somebody who is, for all appearances were solid Christian people who'd grown up in the church, served with Cru, on staff with Cru, the same organization that I work for, had been sharing their faith with people all over the world, and then they suddenly walk away, that is really surprising. And it makes you really sort of look into yourself and say, gosh, well, do they know something I don't know? Are they right? Is this going to happen to me? Right? Could be a little scary. And it just makes you question things sometimes. But maybe that doesn't happen to you, but it happens to me. It's upsetting. And what I want to talk about today is 3 things that I'm going to cover that deal with this, and deal with the process of having doubts, which in these stories of people like Rhett and Link, that's what they were dealing with. Doubt sort of accumulated to the point where they could no longer believe. And so if you've ever experienced that, then this is hopefully going to be helpful. But I want to talk about how or why do deconversions happen? What makes us vulnerable to deconversion or losing our faith? And what can we do when you start to feel those doubts accumulating? You start to feel like you're slipping. What can you do? Is there anything that can be done? And I want to say that I'm not a theologian. I'm not an expert in theology. So the things I'm not going to talk about, I'm not going to try to tell you whether or not Rhett and Link were ever real Christians. I'm not going to talk about whether they're still going to go to heaven or anything like that. I'm just going to talk about it from a kind of a practical, gritty point of view, because all I'm really interested in is what's going to help people avoid deconversion. What's going to help people avoid what happened to them? So this word deconversion might be a strange word. Just real quick, I'll give a little thought on that. But sometimes when a person, when they first understand the gospel and place their faith in Christ, we call that being converted sometimes. That's a word that we use in the church, a conversion. Sometimes we call it being saved or being born again or being confirmed. And so the reverse of that would be deconversion, obviously, right? So no longer believing those things. So that's where this term comes from. All right, so let's dive in. First one, how does deconversion happen? So there's my 3 questions. I forgot they're up there. That's what we're going to talk about. So surprisingly, there's quite a bit of research on deconversion. You might be surprised. I was kind of surprised to find out. A lot of sociologists, psychologists have studied this phenomena and written a lot about it. So I thought I'd share with you some of the things that they have said, the conclusions they've come to from their research, and I'll give some thoughts of my own on this. So this might be surprising. The more controlling, or I don't know a better word for it, the more controlling your church is, the more likely you are to deconvert. So the more your church is always trying to control what people do and think and see and read, the more likely that actually is going to backfire and make people walk away from the faith. So that's a dangerous situation. I had a friend in college named Mike, and Mike grew up in one of these very controlling churches. And the leaders of that church, they believed that dancing was wrong. I mean, there are a lot of Christians who believe that. This is in the South, by the way. This is probably 30-something years ago in the South, ancient history. But they thought dancing was wrong, and they didn't want their youth to be dancing. And so this is what they did. They said, let's tell the kids that if they dance, they'll get cancer. Not a joke. And so the kids were terrified, of course, of dancing, so they didn't dance. But eventually, people like Mike realized that that wasn't true, and that he had been deceived, right? For no matter what the result was, he had been deceived. And it's easy for people in that situation to think, well, what else have I been deceived about? What else were they lying about? And their trust is broken. Now, Mike survived and held on to his faith, but that is a perfect example of how a church that is too controlling, it can kind of backfire. Most deconversions happen between the ages of 18 to 30. So you guys are right on the threshold of this. So it's good to be aware of how it works. 64% of accounts cited intellectual concerns as their primary reason for deconversion. Their primary reason. That is why Faith Ascent exists, and I'm so glad it does. 84% of accounts said that negative interactions with other Christians were a reason for deconversion. So maybe they experienced hypocrisy, maybe they experienced some kind of mistreatment or abuse from people in the church. Those things can cause people to walk away. Sometimes when people ask questions, maybe they're in junior high or younger than you guys, and they start asking questions and they're given trite, unhelpful answers. But a tough question, unresolved, that generates doubt is like a wound. It's like a knife wound. And what happens is they come to their leaders about this and they're given a Band-Aid. And that's just not sufficient. And they might feel better for a little while. Maybe they think, oh, okay, I've got this figured out. But once they get into high school, that's not going to be sufficient. I got messed up my mic. So they realize that the Band-Aid is not going to be sufficient, but they think maybe Christianity, that's all it has is Band-Aids. It doesn't have any serious way to respond to these wounds or these doubts. Often there's perceived conflicts with science. Maybe some places in the Christian world will tell you you have to choose. You can either believe in science or you can believe in Christianity, but not both. There's no exposure to other ways of thinking. They're completely insulated and isolated from the culture at large and other belief systems. And again, you might think, well, this is good. You don't want them to hear this other stuff, because what if they start believing that other stuff and start following this other religion? But again, this tends to backfire. And instead, I think, if you know how vaccinations work, or vaccines, right? A vaccine, and I'm not a scientist, so I might get this a little bit wrong, but it gives you a very tiny amount of the virus or the bacteria, a tiny little amount that your body can easily fight off. And your body produces antibodies that defend you against this particular illness. And so once you have the antibodies sort of programmed in your body, your body can reproduce them at any time. So later, when you're exposed to the real thing in the real world, your body's ready and it can defend itself and fight off the attack. I think the same thing is actually more helpful for young people in the church. You want to tell them a little bit like, okay, you need to understand what you're going to encounter in the real world, these other views, so that you will have some sort of spiritual antibodies, right? You'll be able to defend yourself against these other ideas that conflict with Christianity. So often, so deconversions are more likely when there's absolutely no exposure. And deconversion is usually a slow process. It can happen over years. Some people I know who are atheists, who grew up in the church, that's their story. And honestly, for them, it was a terrifying experience because they felt it slipping away, unraveling over time, but they didn't know what to do. And so they kind of ended up at the end of that slide. But it's not something someone just wakes up one day and says, I don't believe anymore, or decides, as if you could just decide to not believe. It's a slow process. Okay, so the second part of what I want to say, and I'm going to try to go fast so we have lots of time for Q&A. The second part of what I want to say is what makes us vulnerable to this. And I'm going to give you, actually, before I move on, I was going to point out one more thing about Rhett. I spent a little bit of time going over Rhett's story. They published he made like a 2-hour video talking about his whole story and the whole process he went through. And I noticed a couple of things that were interesting that I think he may not have been aware of that might have contributed, or if it had been different, maybe there might have been a different outcome. But one was they use this term often in these stories called deconstruction, deconstructing your faith. And they'll say things like, well, I've deconstructed my faith, now I know the real reasons why I believe. And usually they'll point to like emotional or psychological reasons. Like I was only believing for comfort, or I was only believing out of fear or out of peer pressure. And so those weren't good reasons to believe, so maybe Christianity is not worth believing at all. But this is a clear example of what is called the genetic fallacy. It's a mistake in reason and logic. And basically it goes like this. It's saying, I'm going to reject this idea because of the way I initially believed it. Right? If I initially came to believe something for bad reasons, then I can reject it completely now. And it's often true when you're a little kid, and somebody shares the gospel with you, if you've grown up in church, you might initially believe because, well, your parents do, or because you wanted to get the ice cream afterward, or maybe you initially believed because you were afraid of hell or something like that. And so you think, well, gosh, that was a bad reason for me to believe then. As an adult, you realize that's not going to sustain your belief. So maybe it's just there are no good reasons to believe. But that's a complete mistake, because how you came to believe something has no bearing whatsoever on the truth of Christianity. How you originally came to believe it has nothing to do with whether it's true or not. It could be true and you could have come to believe it for some silly reason, right? The question is, why do you believe now? Also, another thing that was disappointing about Rhett's story was he did a lot of research. I have to commend him on that. He really did a lot of homework. He spent a lot of time studying on these issues. But I don't feel like he ever got the best information on Christianity. And that's why Faith Ascent exists. I'm not here to give a plug or a commercial for Faith Ascent. It's just the truth. This is how I think of it. My slide kind of got messed up. That's all right. There are sort of three levels of answers to hard questions. There's kind of like the level of answer that your teachers or your family can give you, which might be okay for a very young person. But then at the popular level, you have people like Josh McDowell, Ravi Zacharias, Lee Strobel, who are popular writers. They're not scholars. They don't have PhDs in their subject. But they're good. They're very satisfying answers for a young adult probably. And there's critics at that level too. But what happened with Rhett was he read some of the very top level critics, but he only read the middle level responses. He never, as far as I know, he never read any of the highest level, like the academic scholars, the very highest levels of writing on Christianity and apologetics. And so if you're gonna research, or if you're gonna read the critics, great. But make sure you read the corresponding level of answers and responses, right? Because the top level critics against middle level apologists is not a fair fight. You need to, if you're gonna go top level critic, you gotta go top level response. And finally, Rhett had gotten this idea that faith requires certainty. Faith requires absolute 100% certainty and confidence. And I think that's a mistake. Because if you adopt that view, then the minute you have a doubt, the minute you have less than 100%, it feels like the whole thing just comes crashing down like a Jenga tower, right? So those are a few more comments on Rhett. Okay, now, so what are these three ideas that will poisonous ideas that will poison your faith? Certainty is required for faith. I just talked about that. Faith is belief without evidence, and doubt is sin. It's the third one. There it is. And this might surprise you. Maybe you've heard these things. Maybe you believe these things. I think they're false. And I'm going to give some reasons. Hopefully it'll be persuasive. But I think these things do more harm than good to your faith. So I want to talk about each of them. All right. Certainty is required for faith. Now, I've already said I don't agree with this, right? Certainty is required. But what I'd like you to do, although you can't really, turn in groups because you're so far apart, but if we weren't so far apart, I would have you turn in groups, but to come up with, well, what is faith then? If it's not certainty, if it's not 100% certainty, then what is faith? What does it mean? And I think there's a lot of confusion out there about what faith really is, biblical faith. And this is the best, most helpful definition that I've found. Oh, actually, before I get to that definition, let me talk about this guy. Okay, so this is René Descartes, this 17th century French philosopher. Oh, look at the pixels. That is weird. Okay, I guess it's a low resolution. But you get the idea. It's a guy sitting in a chair. Okay, so Descartes really kind of set us off on this whole certainty kick. He was a philosopher, and one day he said, I'm just not really sure if I can trust any of the stuff I've learned, any of the stuff I've been taught. So I'm just going to doubt everything and see if there's just one thing that I know, maybe one thing that I can't doubt, that has to be absolutely certain. And he did. He found one thing, absolutely one. Does anybody know what it is? Yeah. I think, therefore I am. He knew that he could not doubt his own existence. So he got one thing he's absolutely certain of, his own existence. I think, therefore I am. And he couldn't doubt that. And he thought, well, maybe I can start there and prove everything else that I believe deductively from that one sentence, from that one claim. And it's impossible. It doesn't work. And so, honestly, Descartes kind of throws us into a tailspin of skepticism. And there's really only two ways to go after Descartes. Either you adopt his view, say certainty is required for knowledge, and then you just don't know anything. You just have to say, well, I don't know anything. I certainly can't have faith in God, certainly can't have faith in the resurrection, as I don't know if anything's true. Or, on the other hand, you can reject Descartes and say, he was setting the bar too high, and certainty is not required, right? All we need is good evidence that points in a certain direction to have enough to believe, to justify our beliefs. And I think that's the better way to go. That you don't want to be a skeptic about everything. Science is the best example of this. Science is not 100% absolute certainty, right? Science, they gather evidence and do experiments, and they gather evidence and they go, okay, which direction is the evidence pointing? Well, it's pointing towards this conclusion. So that's the most reasonable thing to believe right now. That's how science works. And that is a perfectly reasonable way to go about things. And I think we can do the same thing. We can apply the same kind of principle to our faith. We have evidence, and we believe where the evidence points. Okay, so here's the second poisonous idea. Faith is believing without evidence. So that's one way to think of faith that I think is wrong. But a lot of other people have said what they think faith is, and there's a lot of confusion about this. If you go into a room with 10 people, you get 13 different views on faith. But again, as I mentioned earlier, the most helpful definition that I found is this one. Faith is trusting in what you have good reason to believe is true. So there's those three components. It's something you believe, like God exists, or Jesus is the Messiah. You have reasons. You actually have good reasons to believe it. And you place your trust in it. You actively take steps to live out what you believe. That last part is crucial. So the best example of this that I've heard is the wheelbarrow story of the tightrope walker. Has anybody heard this story before, the tightrope walker? I see a nod, but okay. So this guy is a famous tightrope walker. So one day he took a tightrope and he strung it across Niagara Falls, right? Of course, if you fall, you're dead, right? So he goes across. He has one of those big poles. He goes across, and he comes and he goes all the way back. And then he gets a wheelbarrow, and he puts the wheelbarrow on the tightrope, and he pushes it all the way across, and he comes back. And then he says to this crowd, hundreds of people are gathered there. He says to the crowd, how many of you believe that I could carry a person in this wheelbarrow all the way across and back? And they're all like, yeah, I believe it. I believe you could do it. And then he says, who wants to get in the wheelbarrow? And they're like, not me, That's because they're just short of having faith in this guy, right? If you get in the wheelbarrow, that's faith. That's trust. That's actively taking, okay, I believe he could do it, so now I'm going to step out. I'm going to actually act on that belief. That's what faith is, ultimately. But it involves believing for good reasons, too. Not believing like faith is blind or just believing against the evidence or something like that. You've probably heard that quote from Mark Twain. Since we're in Missouri, he said, faith is believing stuff you know ain't so, which is, he's just trying to be funny, but that's a terrible definition of faith. So, and there's the tightrope walker, acting according to your belief. That's trust. Another reason why I think this idea of faith is belief without evidence is a terrible idea is because when you look in the Bible and you look at a lot of the main players and you look at what God is doing, he's giving tons of evidence, tons of great reasons to believe in the basic tenets of Christianity. If you think about, Jesus did this, he offered people evidence. Paul, this is supposed to be a painting of Paul on Mars Hill. It's absolutely been stylized because that doesn't look anything like Mars Hill. I got to visit there a couple years ago in Athens. But Paul's up there talking to philosophers and all kinds of people, and he's giving evidence, he's giving arguments, he's giving reasons to believe. He does the same thing in the synagogues. He goes in, he says, let's pull out the Bible. Let's look and see where it says the prophecies about Jesus. And so I think we see, people in the Bible giving good reasons for belief. And that's our example, that's what we should expect. And if somebody asked you, what's your evidence? What are your reasons? You might struggle to come up with some. I'm not really sure. But trust me, if I sat down and talked to you for 5 minutes, I could easily show you that you have truckloads of evidence already supporting your belief. Most people are confused about what evidence is. And the third poisonous belief is that doubt is sin. And you may have heard this. You may have been told this. Or maybe you just came to believe it on your own because you just thought, well, faith is what God wants, so if I doubt, that must be sin. But I think that's a mistake. I think there are really two kinds of doubt. The word is used two different ways, even in the New Testament. And one way is as a noun, where you might just talk about, I have some doubt, like I have some cake, right? Like it's a noun. Like I have a few doubts. I have a little bit of doubt. I have a doubt about that. This is a pretty mild form of doubt. So you believe something, but you might have just a little bit of, I could be wrong about this, right? So, for instance, if you ask me, are you going to live to be 80 years old? I think there's a pretty good chance. I have a little bit of doubt about that. But I think, I believe I could make it to 80. But I have a little bit of doubt. Mainly because a few years ago, I got diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's, and that can tend to hasten your demise a little bit. 10 years ago, if you asked me if I'd make it to 80, I'd be like, oh yeah, no problem. My family lives a really long time. But now I've got some doubts, right, about how far I'm going to make it. But there's that noun doubt, but there's also verb doubt. And this is the problematic kind of doubt. Verb doubt is a view that a certain claim is just false. If you ask me whether or not we're going to have a hurricane in St. Louis tomorrow, I'd say, I doubt that. I doubt that we'll have a hurricane. Because I don't believe it. It just means I don't believe we will. I'm actually pretty certain it won't happen, actually. So, but doubting, using the word as a verb, is when you see that in the New Testament, that's usually unbelief. And that is a problem, right? If you are slipping across the threshold of unbelief. But lots of people have something they believe, but they do have some doubt. There's even a story where Jesus casts a demon out of this man's daughter, and Jesus says, well, if you had just believed a certain way or had faith, and the man says, I do believe, help me with my unbelief. Right? He's acknowledging, it's like, I believe, but I'm struggling. Can you help me? And I think that's just the right kind of attitude to have when you do struggle. And if you want to know how God responds to doubt, what God thinks of your doubts, then I think you have to look at the person of Jesus. And I think there's two stories that I'll mention, but there are lots of examples of Jesus encountering people who have some doubts, and he is always very encouraging and gracious toward them. Think of John the Baptist. So John is, he announces the Messiah is here. And then at some point in the story, he's arrested, thrown in jail, and he's going to be beheaded. So he's probably thinking, okay, this is not what I pictured at all. Is Jesus really the Messiah? So he sends a messenger to Jesus and to say, Jesus, are you really the one, or we need to look somewhere else? And Jesus, instead of, he didn't rebuke John or say, John, you need to have more faith. What's wrong with you? Stop doubting. No, he said, go tell John what you've seen here. The blind, their eyes are open. The deaf can hear. The prisoners are set free. Well, except John. And he says, but go back and tell John that. And that was evidence to support his belief, to strengthen his belief, because the Old Testament prophesied that that's what would happen when the Messiah came. And he says, go tell John it's happening. So he supports his belief. Even Thomas gets a bad rap. There's Thomas putting his finger in the side of Jesus' wounds. Thomas gets a bad rap, but when he said, I'm not going to believe unless I see, put my fingers in the holes in his hands and my hand in his side. And Jesus appears and he says, all right, come on over. Here you go. Good, stick your finger in there. And Thomas is like, my Lord, my God, I believe. Thomas, his faith was struggling. He wasn't sure what to believe. He needed a little assistance. And God responded graciously. Jesus responded graciously to his doubts. So the last part of my talk before the Q&A is, what do I do when I'm struggling? So what do I do with this information about doubt? Well, a couple of things. I would say stay in community. Maybe one of the most important things. Stay in community. Don't try to handle this alone. If you bury it all inside and hide it out of shame or fear that someone's going to be mean to you about it or condemn you, it's just going to fester. Again, it's like that wound that needs attention. You don't want to let it fester and become infected. So share it. Find a person you can trust and share about these doubts. And it might be hard to find someone. Maybe it is going to involve, going to other kinds of sources like a good book or a YouTube video. But you need to deal with it in community as much as you possibly can. And actually, and don't forget about the 3 poisonous beliefs that I mentioned. You might check and see if you're hanging on to any of those. But also, you want to pray. And when I say pray, I mean whatever's on your mind, whatever's in your heart. I mean, people might be surprised by this, but I think when you pray, nothing is off limits. There's nothing that you cannot say to God. Hey, there's nothing he can't handle. I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to hide how you really feel, all that anger or frustration or fear. He already knows about all of it. So you might as well just be honest. If you just need to vent some anger, have you read the Psalms? I mean, you got people in there venting anger at God, saying, God, what's wrong with you? Why haven't you done this? People afraid, people depressed, suicidal. I mean, this is all in the Psalms. People wrestling with real questions, real doubt, real issues. So when you pray, just let it all out to God, right? Just be honest. Don't try to candy coat it. And then I want to introduce one last concept before I finish that I think it's helpful for me, so maybe it'll be helpful for you. So, and this is kind of philosophical terms here. So when you believe something, sometimes you can come across some information that gives you a reason to doubt your belief, right? And we call that a defeater. A defeater is an idea or a claim that sort of goes against what you believe, and it makes you sort of doubt what you believe a little bit. So let me give a non-religious, simple example. So suppose, my wife and I decided to go to the St. Louis Zoo. And so we go to the zoo, and we go to over the place where the zebras are. And I go, wow, look at those beautiful zebras. Those are amazing. And my wife says, not a lot of people know this, but I have inside information that when they were going to get some zebras for the zoo, they're all out, so they couldn't get any zebras. So what they did is they got a bunch of mules and painted them black and white to look like zebras. So now I believe those are zebras, but now I've been given a defeater. I've been given a reason to doubt that those are really zebras. Right now I'm like, I don't know what to think. So the natural thing that you need to do if you have a defeater and you want to try to resolve it is what you need is something to defeat that defeater. You need a defeater, right? So to kind of balance out the scale. So the defeater pulls you toward unbelief or doubt, right? Skepticism. But a defeater would be another thing, like you sneak into the zebra cage with some soap and washcloth and water, and you try to wash the paint off, and it doesn't come off. You're like, this is a real zebra. You shave it completely down, and its skin is black and white. Hey, so I've just defeated the defeater. So now my faith is restored. My belief, I can rest easy with my belief. These are real zebras, and what I heard wasn't true. And why my wife would lie to me about that, I don't know why. It's terrible. So that's what a defeater is. But you also have to have a defeater that's the same strength as your original defeater, right? And so you encounter these all the time, reasons to doubt the trustworthiness of the Bible, reasons to doubt that God exists, reasons to doubt that Jesus rose from the dead. You might read these things or come across them anywhere. And these are defeaters. And if you ignore that and you don't do anything about it to go and see if there's answers to these questions, then you're just left with a bunch of things eating away at your faith. So you need defeaters. And then if you really want to do the job thoroughly, get some additional defeaters and accumulate them, right? So that it's going to outbalance the defeater and restore confidence in what you believe. So this requires a little bit of work, right? I mean, nobody likes, I got to read more books, or, YouTube's probably got some great stuff out there. There's plenty of people you can talk to who have great information on this. That's why Faith Ascent exists. But don't ignore the defeaters when they come around. Don't be passive and just say, well, I'm just going to believe whatever hits me. Whatever comes my way, that'll be what I work with. Sometimes you got to go out and find them. You got to do a little research. Okay, and then finally, if you find yourself stuck with defeaters and you're really struggling and you feel like your faith is about 50-50, you're about 50-50 on whether it's true or not, Pascal's wager is a great idea. And I think there might even be somebody talking about Pascal's wager this week. But Pascal was another famous French philosopher and mathematician who basically said, listen, if you're about 50-50 on it, then think of it like a bet. If you bet on Christianity and you decide to just continue on the path of being a Christian or embrace it and live out Christianity, if it turns out to be true, then hey, you gain everything, like infinite gain. If it turns out to be false and there's no God, what have you lost? Nothing. You're worm food, right? But if you go the other way, if you bet against it and it turns out to be true, infinite loss, right? Perhaps infinite, eternal separation from God. That's a pretty big loss. But if it turns out to be true, or if it turns out to be false, then you really haven't gained anything by being an atheist, right? You're still going to be worm food. So he says it makes more sense rationally to take the bet and try it out and try to live it out. And he says, go to church, sing the songs, pray the prayers, read the Bible, be a part of the community, and you may just find yourself slowly accumulating more reasons to believe and finding yourself with a faith restored. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. It was kind of fast. Q&A, I want to do that, and I can recommend a few books if you're interested. But if you have some questions right off the bat, I'll take them. And if you want to write them on a piece of paper, I don't know if we can turn them in anonymously. Yeah?
Did Paul say that those who left us were not in us? If they were in us, then they would have stayed? Does that mean that people can't actually be converted, that if they're real Christians, they're like...
Yeah. That's a great question. So you're quoting, I guess, a verse. I'm not sure where that is, but if they had really, it's like saying if they were really Christians, they wouldn't have left. Because if you're a real Christian, you persevere to the end. This is the theology stuff that I didn't want to get into. But I know these are important questions, but I'm just not an expert on these things. My expertise is in epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and belief, right? How you form your beliefs and the evidence for your beliefs. So that's what I talk about because that's kind of the stuff I feel comfortable with. Theologically, there are different views on that, right? If you're a Calvinist, then you're going to say all true Christians will persevere to the end. So if someone falls away, they were never a Christian to begin with. But that's tough to swallow because when I look at people like Rhett and Link, who are on staff with the same ministry I work for, doing the same things I was doing, I'm just like, if they weren't Christians, I mean, it's really hard to believe that they were not Christians ever. And all their reports about their experiences, it was all false. I mean, it's hard to buy, But if you're theologically committed to that view, then that's fine, There are problems both ways. So, yeah.
So, if you, know someone who seems to be having some doubts, is there, a way that you can talk to them?
Absolutely. I think if I had a friend who was struggling with these doubts, the first thing I would be sure to do is make them feel like they can share them without being judged, right? You're not going to criticize them. You're not going to condemn them. You're not going to yell at them, but you're going to listen. And you're there to listen and offer whatever help you can, but you're not there to judge them. Because often people are scared to talk about their doubts because they feel like people will judge them. So that's the first thing I would do is make sure they felt safe talking about those things. But, I would just encourage them to check out there's tons of resources out there, whether it's books, stuff on YouTube, blogs. There may even be speakers who come to something like Faith Ascent, and do it with them, right? Don't say, hey, you go read this book. Say, hey, let's read this book together. Or, hey, you go watch that video. It's like, hey, let's watch this together. Because I think community is a really important part of being able to sustain your faith. So, yeah, I mean, that's a great question. You know, what do you do with a friend who's struggling? I mean, and you also, it's good in conversation as you're listening to them and letting them share, you get a better sense of where they're really at. Because sometimes you might think they're here in the process, but they're really way over here. So you want to listen to make sure you have an accurate diagnosis, right? That you know where they're really at. It might be that they are terrified of losing their faith, and they will do anything. They're like, I really want to believe. I really want to keep my faith. And that's important to know, as opposed to somebody who's like, I don't even really care, you know. I mean, you're going to have a hard time helping that person because they don't want to help. They don't want anybody to help them, you know. So it might be good to try to discern where they're at in that sense, where their heart is. Yeah. Other questions? You could follow up those questions. Yeah.
In Hebrews, it says, something like, if they reject God, then they cannot be saved. But they'll be saved the second time. They like Jesus off the cross again, and that be like if they're saved, they can't be saved the second time.
Yeah, that's Hebrews 5 and 6. That is a tricky passage. You know, let's just be honest. There are some parts of the Bible that are really hard to understand. It's not obvious. And we often need help of experts to help us interpret what's going on there. And I know that there are different views on that passage and what it means. Typically what will happen is if you're already committed to a certain theology, then you'll read it a certain way. But if you're committed to this kind of theology, you'll read it a different way. It's very difficult to come at it from a purely objective standpoint. But you know, again, like I'm not a scholar of the New Testament. You know, I mean, I know people who are experts on that stuff, and I defer to them. So I mean, I would recommend reading a real theologian or a New Testament scholar on that. So I could probably recommend a few afterward or through email if this is something you're really struggling with to understand. It's hard. It's hard. There are no easy answers. Yeah.
So how do you discern, especially people who are going through deconversion or in stages of that process, seem to also be going through forms of depression? So if you're trying to advocate or walk with someone who's going through that, are there ways to help, like, differentiate doubt versus depression?
Wow, what a great question. Yeah, how do you tell the difference between depression and like doubt, struggles with like intellectual or emotional issues with the faith? They all get wrapped up together. It's really hard to separate them out. I mean, what would I do? I mean, I think it's going to take a lot of listening. I mean, just like I mentioned to you, you don't want to give them quick answers, pat answers, rehearsed answers, canned answers, because you might miss the target completely. So, I mean, I would be in conversation with that person, listening a lot to find out what's really going on. And that may reveal some things. That might be helpful just in the process of really listening to them talk about what's going on. But sometimes if they're really struggling with depression and they've never had any help with depression, then that might be a good idea to say, well, maybe there's some things we could do to help that before we start dealing with some of these intellectual issues. So you might even just try to have a two-pronged approach, perhaps. But, I mean, telling the difference, I suppose if a person says that they have a doubt, a particular question about the Bible or about God, but there's nothing you can say that can sway them at all, they are completely unmovable, then it might not really be an intellectual issue. It might be more of a heart issue. It could be the depression. It could be something else, some anger that they have. So sometimes you have to be discerning and and just trying to find out whether it's really an intellectual question that they have or if it's more of an emotional, psychological issue. So, but I don't even know if that's a real answer, but that's a hard case. That's a hard case.
I guess just, are there any tools for that discernment or a book?
Wow. I can't think of any offhand. Maybe you need to write that book. That's the book. That's your destiny right there. Other questions? Yeah.
As people that are entering the age group that is deconverted now,
Yeah.
what are some suggestions you have for us to, while we deal with our doubts, to try and deal with as well and to stay strong in our faith?
Well, I mean, I like to read. I'm a nerd, but not everybody's as nerdy as I am. But I mean, books are always great, and I can always recommend some great books. So I have 3 that I'll recommend right now. There's a book called Love Your God with All Your Mind by J.P. Moreland, like Moreland. Love Your God with All Your Mind. That's an excellent, excellent book for this kind of issue. The Reason for God by Tim Keller is a wonderful book of dealing with some of these hard questions. And a book about Pascal's Wager called Taking Pascal's Wager by Michael Rota, R-O-T-A. And I'm happy if you want to share your email or something, I can send those to you, all the specifics. So books are great. I mean, find a community, whether it's in your church or somewhere else, where you can gather together with some other people and say, hey, let's read a book together, or let's watch this video together and talk about it. But it's going to take a little bit of work. You don't want to go into college unprepared. I mean, that's what this week is all about. I think, address the specific questions you have, especially. And if you've heard critiques of Christianity, again, make sure you're matching levels, right? If you read a popular guy like Richard Dawkins, then you can read Lee Strobel, and that's fine. But if you read somebody like Bart Ehrman, then you're going to need to go N.T. Wright, right? A real scholar, or Mike Licona. I mean, make sure you're not isolating yourself. That's really crucial. Because we're easier to pick off. The enemy can pick us off when we're by ourselves. But when we're in a community, a herd, not that we're just mindless animals, but when you're in a herd, it's easier to be protected. It's when you get isolated that you're easy to pick off. So stay in community. What's that? Oh, the second book? The Reason for God by Tim Keller, K-E-L-L-E-R. A great book that addresses some of the biggest hard questions. Really well written. He's really enjoyable to read. And I don't have a watch or anything. I don't know how we're doing on time.
I think we can go 5 minutes over because they got to move this way.
Okay. All right. Any other questions out there? I see a hand. Yes. It could, what Michael Rota, who wrote the book I'm talking about, called Taking Pascal's Wager, he says, really Pascal's Wager is only going to be helpful if you're about 50-50, at least 50-50 regarding Christianity already, right? So if you only have about 20% confidence in Christianity and you're looking at some other religions, it's not going to be that helpful. But if you're right at that line, right at that threshold, you're like, gosh, I'm just really undecided, it will actually be very helpful in that case. And it avoids that problem. But just any random person taking Pascal's Wager is not going to help them decide which religion to believe. You'll need other considerations for that. But Michael Rota, he says, you can compare religions, and some of them will have more coherence, more correspondence, more logic, more evidence than other religions. So they're not all completely equal. Maybe one more question? Yeah. Oh, is that a hand or no, it's just exercising your fingers. Okay. Maybe you have a particular doubt that maybe you don't want to say it right in front of the big group, but you can always email me. You could go to my blog, groundbelief.com, like ground beef, but ground belief. And there's videos and other kinds of stuff on there, and I have a YouTube channel. some stuff on there may be helpful. All right, is that it? All right, thanks, y'all.